welcome back to the TowerCast Podcast, the towering podcast for the towering filmmaker of El Paso and the world. We're back with another episode. I think the last time we saw you guys on this podcast, at least kind of on a consistent level, was for the Las Cruces International Film Festival.
Oh, yeah.
That was a lot of fun, man. We talked to a ton of great people. If you haven't seen those episodes, go check out like the Giancarlo Esposito episode. We talked to Kevin Reynolds. We talked to Ed Stone. And then even in years prior, we talked to Melissa Barrera and William H. Macy and all these guys, Charles, all these dudes. So like it's been a lot of fun to do that festival and to talk to a lot of people. And there's a couple more festivals coming up, at least here locally for us. There's going to be a ton of fun. Things like the El Paso Film Festival, the El Paso Media Fest, and of course Las Cruces again next year. So we may have some exciting guests to share with you at that point. However, we're in studio with virtually with a very exciting guest, and I'll get into that. Let me make sure and introduce my fellow co-host, Mr. Michael Lalo.
Thank you, guys. I'm back with the cinematography perspective, as always.
Mr. John Eric Passero.
I'm back with the actor's perspective, and I'm excited for this guy's house.
Yeah. And Mr. Austin Young in the back, make sure we're sounding good there. Awesome. And at the time of this recording, I'm not sure when this episode drops. I think it's the first week of September. But at the time of this recording, we have Mr. Austin Young's birthday. It's Mr. Young's birthday in studio. You can't see it because there's no camera on him today, but balloons and cake and all this jazz that we kind of brought down to the studio.
Party hat and tutus and the whole nine,
the whole shebang, really. But happy birthday, Austin. Thank you for everything you do for Tower, man, and everything you do for the podcast. Best. And everybody listening out there knows that you're the guy making sure we're doing our jobs.
Absolutely.
Right? I'm your humble film servant, Carlos de la Torre. Make sure I give you some perspective on directing and writing and producing. Just a little bit. I try. No, but it's been a great ride with Tower so far, man. This year has been our busiest in terms of development, in terms of getting projects off the ground, despite the fact that there's a writer's strike, there's an actor's strike, which I want to ask our guest about because I'm sure he's feeling the effects of that as well, just like us and anybody who's a storyteller in this medium. So without further ado, I have to introduce the great, the awesome Mr. Ellar Coltrane. You may know him from a ton of amazing films that he's done and TV shows and stuff like that. But he did Boyhood with one of my heroes, Richard Linklater. Has always been a hero of mine, and I definitely want to talk to him about that. But last time I met up with Ellar, we were talking a little bit about The Last Movie Star and seeing Burt Reynolds in that capacity and one of his final roles and The Circle, and just a bunch of stuff. And not to mention, he's a big champion of indie stuff. I saw him, heard him in a mutual friend of ours' film, The Weird Kids, here at a screening here at the Plaza Theater in El Paso. And his character was just a tons of fun, and he came down to do that as well. So yeah, he's a big champion of indie stuff, big champion of indie films. And his upcoming stuff sounds very exciting. So without further ado, Ellar, thank you for being on the podcast. Thank you for being on the TowerCast today.
Thanks so much.
Hello. Thank you.
So, Ellar, you have a lot of perspective for us, man. You have a lot of perspective for us. And the way we like to kick off this podcast usually is, how did you start your storytelling career? What made you want to become a storyteller?
When did you get the acting bug?
Or anything else, right? If it wasn't acting at first, if it was writing, if it was whatever,
True.
Yeah. No, I mean, acting really was the first thing for me. It was almost kind of like a given, I think I have found as I've grown into my life and my career, the career that I have had, like I've, I think found my own relationship with acting specifically. But my mom was a stage actor. My dad has been a performing musician my entire life. And I was homeschooled for most of my childhood. And so there's this theater school called Zachary Scott in Austin that I did summer camps at. I think the first thing I really remember is improv classes that we would do there. And then plays, we did Shakespeare, like, you know, little kid versions of Shakespeare stuff. And that was really the beginning of it, you know, and it was just like my school, you know,
Right.
like I was like, I liked it. I've always loved movies, you know, like that's really the thing, is just like watching films and talking about films was kind of one of the biggest things that my dad and I bonded over, like from a really young age.
What were some of those conversations? Do you remember some of those? Like, one thing I know Gus was always curious about, and all of us, right, is like, what was that film that you may have seen with your dad? What was that film that you guys could nonstop talking about that really kicked off this like, man, that was amazing. Can I do that? Or you
still go back to it.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing that is not exactly answering your question, but one thing that I do remember very much from early childhood is that, like, when there were movies like The Matrix, like I remember being so excited about The Matrix, but like I was too young. You know, I mean, that movie came out in what, 98 or 99? So I was like 5 years old. So like I wasn't allowed to see that movie, but my dad would like describe the plots of movies that were too adult for me to see.
Oh wow.
And so like those are really some of the earliest memories I have of like thinking really hard about movies and like trying to imagine them as they're just being described to me verbally. So like, I don't know, I just feel like having that relationship, like it just framed my relationship with the kind of storytelling of film in a certain way, to be like, you know, even while I'm watching something, like just really like analyzing the, you know, the script and the narrative, and like also kind of having my own imaginative version of it, almost like as I'm watching a film. So like, yeah, The Matrix is definitely an early one, but it's like my relationships with that movie started before I saw it.
Because it feels like sometimes when you're with your family and they're describing a film, especially like I had that at a young age too. My dad's like a big cinephile in his own way. And I learned to love movies through the way that he would talk about them, which was very conceptual. So you found film to be something with meaning and something with purpose and intention. So then before you even watch it, you're already thinking about it like that. I'm guessing it's a similar experience, right?
Yeah,
Now,
definitely.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
See, I came up different. See, I came up with like 3 movies that I always watched, which one of them was The Matrix, Cable Guy. Those are just the ones that I watched.
Matrix, Cable Guy. What was the third one?
Ace Ventura.
Ace Ventura, of course. Yeah. That's an interesting perspective. I'm in the similar way. My parents were not artistic per se. They didn't pursue the arts, definitely not as a career, and not really outside of music to a certain extent, not really. And I just had that bug, but I didn't know what it meant. You know, I would watch cinema and just love it. You know, with my brother, we'd watch things like Back to the Future and a ton of the action comedies that were super popular, you know, like Rush Hour 2, and we didn't know what this was, and we didn't know why it made us. A part of it was like, you know, having a shitty childhood and escapism, and just kind of using that forum to just escape a little bit from our kind of a reality but then once I knew what it was, and once more than anything, I have a friend who tells me all the time, like, it's funny, man, when I was young, I thought gods made films. I didn't know there was a profession. I didn't know there was a director. I just thought they came out of somewhere, like, you know.
Right.
And it's a very interesting thing to kind of draw that out. And specifically in your case, Ellar, I think it's fascinating that your mom being a stage performer, you probably grew up in the theater, you know, and hanging out and going to rehearsals and going to, you know, dress rehearsals and just hanging out for stuff like that. But your mind frame of acting, at least, or storytelling, was cinema, was film, on the film format. How was that? Did you explore theater a little bit, or was that everything where like, no, I want to be a theater actor, or was it just like, I really love movies and I want to get closer to this format?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, film has always kind of been my, you know, my, I don't know, interest, my hobby, special interest, theater, like I said, that was just kind of like my school, more or less. So it's like, I enjoyed it enough, but it wasn't something that I was like, I didn't, as a 4-year-old, be like, I want to do this. I want to go do.
It was just your norm. Your norm.
Gentleman of Verona or whatever. Like, it was just like that was the class that I was doing, and the social environment that I had, you know. And I think that was really most of it. Like, was just the social environment.
Okay.
And like being part of a cast, of a crew, you know, which is honestly still like with really all film and theater and, you know, so many different artistic practices, like just the creation of it is one thing, but also just being part of a collaborative community, like is almost my favorite part of it, you know. And that's I've done a lot of, you know, behind the camera stuff, not camera work, but
but like art department. I know you work.
I've done a lot of art department and, you know, set design and set dressing and all that kind of stuff. And I really love being a part of the mechanism and being a part of a team in that way, you know. And that's really, even with film, like that is more what my relationship with it was about growing up. Like,
was that that's what I wanted to ask in terms of like your first kind of experiences in front of the camera, or on a set in general. Because correct me if I'm wrong, Austin, and this is due in part to people like Robert Rodriguez and Linklater, and, you know, Elizabeth Avian, who's been a friend of the podcast for a while now, tells us stories all the time on how Austin was bubbling up with productions, you know, especially in the early 2000s and moving forward, right? Which is where you were exposed to it, if I'm not mistaken. So what was that first time being on a set? What was that first time that you got to like, oh, what is this magic? Like I see 10,000 crew members running around, you know, in some capacity doing something. And I just love being a part of this voodoo, this magic here. Like, what was that like for you? What was that first experience?
Well, I mean, my literal first experience on set was, I'm pretty sure, a film called Lone Star State of Mind.
Lone Star State of Mind.
It was like, Austin indie film. It had, what was that guy's name? He played Sandman in the third Spider-Man movie.
Thomas Hayden Church.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So he was in it, but he was, you know, before he was in Spider-Man.
That's cool.
But, you know, it was a very small part. Like, my memories of that are pretty vague. I don't think I had a deep awareness of really what was going on around me. So definitely, like, Boyhood was, you know, my real introduction to like being a collaborator. And just experiencing this, you know, the workings of a set and the community of a set, you know, and that, like, as I've learned as an adult now and like working on all kinds of other projects, like that was a special environment, you know.
We're gonna have to dive deep into this, man, as we dive into your career, because like you said, if it sets precedent, look, you were thrust into this. If this was your first really kind of experience, it was number one. You were the lead. You were cast into the lead of something like this with opposite actors that not only were at the peak of their career at that time, but are phenomenal actors. You know, Ethan Hawke, Patricia Arquette. I mean, like these are top of the line people, right? And a top of the line director to both. Like you were thrust into this at a young age with those people around you. Now, I'm sure you learned a ton, but what was that experience like to go from like, all right, I'm going to start, you know, pursuing auditions and kind of going for this thing, and then boom, I'm part of a major motion picture that is going to take, you know, so many years to shoot.
Couple years. And
in that process, I'm going to have to come back every year with these amazing kind of individuals. What did Boyhood set for you as a precedence for other? I mean, it's almost like if, you get thrown into this world And I hope it didn't ruin it for you for other experiences, because you were thrown into just this magical experience right off the top.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, I was 6 when I was cast in that movie. And like, I mean, my parents showed me, like, I had seen some Linklater films. I saw more, leading up to that, like when I started auditioning and stuff. And of course, watched some of Ethan and Patricia's films. So like I had an idea of who they were, but still, like as a 6-year-old, you can't really
wrap your head around it. Yeah.
That's a pretty good advantage, right?
Of these figures, and especially Richard, most directly in my life, like he is, especially at that point, like he was very much of just a fixture of the Austin kind of art community, and it's like everybody, it's half of my extended friends and family of my parents, like we're in Slacker, and we're around for all of that. And so it was very much a part of this narrative, just of Austin, of Richard's career, and of him kind of, him and a few other folks kind of creating the film scene there, in the 90s and early 2000s. But like
you feel like you were too young. That must have been an advantage, right? Like you were too young to...
there's no way to comprehend that. There's no way for me to comprehend, that element of it, or like what 12 years means.
So was it just your yearly, I'm gonna come back to this film family to do this thing, but I'm not gonna know what it means until I'm 17, 18, that I really, like, is that when it really hit you? Or was it just, what was that process for you? Like just something that you knew you loved to do, you knew you loved to act, and I'm gonna come and exercise that muscle and have fun. I don't know if you guys shot in the summers or when you did it, but come have fun in the summers and shoot so many days, and then when you finally saw it, we're like, whoa, that's I didn't realize how big of a part this really played.
Yeah. I mean, when over the 12 years of production, it was mostly felt like a summer camp, and like a film camp, because like I was acting, but I got to be a part of so much of it from such a young age, like most of the, anyone who's, I don't need to rehash everything. Anyone who's listened to any coverage of Boyhood knows probably some about how the scripts were written, but we workshopped everything, basically. Like that's pretty much all of the dialogue was like, Richard would have something, and then in the weeks leading up to the production for that year, the actors would get together and we would, create what would become the actual dialogue.
It's a ton of his process, right? I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's a ton of his process to point out, like, go watch. We obsessed over the Before trilogy when we covered that on our podcast and another podcast. And it's one of my most influential things in my kind of storytelling, these dialogue pieces that are super heavy and talk about subjects that people, I don't know, were too taboo at the time, didn't really want to get into. Some people find these dialogue pieces boring, but they're the most fascinating things for me. And Boyhood touches on, hey, I'm a product of divorce. I'm going to watch Boyhood and shed a tear because I know exactly what these characters are going through. Growing up in this kind of environment, and then going through that kind of change in the end, but at the same time breaking free of that world, and your character going into college, and kind of this freeing element of your character in that regard. I mean, it resonates with me heavily. So Richard Linklater's process, if you go back to like the Before trilogy or to any of his films, really, he sits with actors for months at a time. And literally that's why Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy have even writing credit on the last, Before Midnight. So like, before the same reason, like they're so important actors in your scenario. I mean, you got to experience that firsthand. Like, were you just there as a kid pitching lines and pitching ideas and just going with the flow, or what was your kind of experience in that regard with Rick?
Yeah, I mean, Richard has, I think, maybe his greatest gift is the way that he like brings brings actors in and like brings the truth and the soul of his actors in to like almost utilize as, you know, paints. I mean, that's really how kind of he talked about it, you know. It's like that, and that's just this whole other element, you know, that for the kind of stories that he tells, like brings in things that he can't know, you know, like definitely in the case of Boyhood, I think, you know, probably Patricia is the most kind of like pointed example of like her experience as a single mother, like bringing all of everything that she brought to her character in the script is something that like none of us, definitely Richard, none of us could know, like could know that experience,
as
know
a
the
mom,
things
as a woman,
and
right?
like, and that's true of everyone, you know, like in many ways, Boyhood is Richard's story. Like, I think the, you know, the bones, the skeleton of the narrative and a lot of the beats, like he's telling the story of his experience and his childhood, but like bringing us in to just kind of lend our hearts to it, like create something so much more rich and like universal, you know, I think. And I think as a kid, like, I can't be aware of any of that, you know. I think to me, growing up, like just being a part of the kind of art scene and these just like the art itself, but then also just the artists, these kind of larger than life figures of like Richard Linklater and Bob Schneider and Robert Rodriguez, and like that was our mythology in Austin.
What was I want to touch on that a bit. What was that scene like? I mean, it's obviously Austin still very much has a great artist scene all around, but I mean, you were in the middle of it, in the thick of it, when there was a huge film boom in Austin. What were your eyes seeing in all of this, especially for film? Like, you saw a lot of people running around, going to Austin to do their productions, and then being pretty damn successful on that on all accounts, box office to critically acclaimed to bringing more attention to the Texas film scene. What did you see? What did you kind of experience in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up, like, I mean, what I was kind of saying about, for me, the focus seeming like the kind of mythology of like identity of like the characters of artists, you know, and art being like kind of like just like any egoic like expression or accessory, like that's kind of was my conception of art, I think, for the first, you know, until I was about 10 or 11.
Okay.
And I think around then is when my parents divorced. And, you know, that began a rough time in my life. And like, that was, for me personally, like that is when I discovered, I don't know, I guess a deeper relationship with film as like soothing practice, escape, like you mentioned, escapism. It definitely became escapism, but then also like I just started to discover that watching certain movies made me feel better.
Sure.
When my life didn't feel good, you know, and through that starting to wonder like why is that? Like, what is it about watching the same film every day that like gives me something that I'm lacking in my life, or you know, soothes something in me, you know, and this kind of idea of, you know, a relationship with characters and using, you know, the narratives of characters to reflect on things in my own life or understand things about myself, you know, like that was 10, 11, 12, 13 is like when I started to, I guess, think about art and film specifically more from the perspective of the audience and more so like as a tool, you know, instead of just like, oh, here's this thing that's an expression of of me, like behold it. And
well,
it
did Richard? I mean, you obviously did other films in between, and Richard or Ethan or anybody that you worked on just while we're on Boyhood. Did they reference anything for you? Like, hey, you should over the summer watch these list of films. I know Richard works like that a little bit in terms. Well, probably not with a kid. Like he probably won't overload you with films as a kid. But were there any references that you're like, hey, as you mature, as a storyteller, or as you mature as somebody who's consuming cinema, you should really check this film out. I know Julie, for others, Rich's films, she's a director well within her own right. Ethan's a director well within his own right. So like, I'm sure they have a plethora of like, hey, like you should really. I know you love these kinds of movies, so check this one out or check that one out. Was there ever references that you started taking and just like it developing your palette for film?
Not really. I think there was an intentional. I think there was an intention with Richard and Ethan to kind of
let you be a kid,
create a space for me and the other kids that was like outside of the world of film.
Oh wow!
Like he didn't want us to be thinking about that we're making a film or thinking about how it's going to look or how it's going to be perceived. Like that was what the adults were doing, and I think part of how Richard was able to like achieve the naturalist performances from a bunch of children was by sort of doing a lot to like remove the element of the awareness of like, this is a film that's going to be a product that will be viewed by people. Like it, the feeling of it being just like a summer camp, learning about film, working on a project with a bunch of family friends, basically. Like, I think that was very intentional, know?
It creates a more like comfortable setting, right? Where it's not this, like as an adult, there's more pressure behind what's the intention, where is it all going, what's the direction feeling like, or like even referencing films. But I guess for kids and like you saying it's almost like a summer camp setting, I guess that created like a better environment where it was just, you didn't have to worry about failing, I guess, as much.
Yeah, or just self-consciousness. Whether you're worrying about something specific or not, I think just it is as any actor knows, like it's a serious practice to learn how to interact with the camera and the hypothetical audience through the camera. And once you've been in a film that has been finished and shown to people, like you can never know that. You can never unexperience that. And you forever then, when you are in the presence of a camera, in front of a camera, there is this, a metaphysical connection to the eventual audience.
What was your experience in the reception in that regard, right? Because Mr. Castro here, whenever we shoot a film and, we're premiering it somewhere, we're, I don't want to see myself on the screen. I don't want to, because I can't change certain things anymore. Picture lock, whatever. What was, we'll talk about the general reception of everybody, because this film broke the news in terms of innovation in cinema for that era. But in your regard, what was your first experience seeing the final product? What was it?
It was crazy.
How old were you? You were what, 17, 18?
I was 19.
Okay.
Yeah, I was 19. I was 19 when the final episode was, I guess it was like right after or right before my 19th birthday. I don't remember exactly. And then there was a cut for me to watch within 6 months. So it was like that next spring.
Was that like
a PA from the Detour office came and brought me a Blu-ray at where I was living in Austin, and Richard told me to watch it by myself, and I did. I mean, it's difficult to find words, and I watched it so many times in the 2 years, following that. and my relationship with it has shifted so much, you know, that it's hard to remember exactly like that first time, but it was cathartic. I mean, that's the main experience for me with that film overall, that it just like, there is an outpouring of emotion that is difficult to understand or describe, you know, and I think that then in different ways translated to, you know, a whole lot of people who watched it obviously had, you know, big emotional experiences with it. But yeah, I mean, I think the way it felt to watch it by myself that first time, of just this like, I mean, honestly, the best way to describe it is like, it was like an acid trip. It was like a psychedelic experience of just like,
So
I don't know how else to describe it. Just like watching myself grow up.
Yeah.
Like what other, you know, what people have that experience?
Exactly.
Like, you know, the Harry Potter kids in some ways.
Right. That's a good point.
Like the 7-Up
but
kids.
not so
but not in
immediately,
one
right?
movie.
Yeah, not in
Ways.
one viewing, right? Not in one's
Right. Yeah, I mean, to have it be this just like time lapse, you know, that if you remove the artifice and the script and the context of it, and just for me,
it's a home video of you growing up.
My physical body grow up and remembering what, you know, everything around it, like I don't know, it was mind blowing, you know. But then, you know, whatever, a year or however many months later, then we're premiering at, you know, Sundance.
I was about to say, now it belongs to the world, right? We as filmmakers know that once a film is shared with the world, it belongs to them now. Well,
I didn't know that. You know, that's the thing. You know, I had no concept of what it meant or what it would feel like to release a film, or that, you know, or the way that releasing this film would be. I mean, I think Richard, like, I mean, I remember when they were finishing it right before I was watching the cut, like, you know, Richard kind of sitting me down and being like, I don't want you to be disappointed if no one cares about this movie. Like, it's really important to us, and like, it will always be this thing for us, but there's like a decent chance that no one will get it or care, you know? And so it's like, that was almost the perspective that I was coming to it from. Like, I'm just like, you know, I was like living in a school bus, like, you know, we're like dirty, degenerate Austin artists. That's was my life and my community. And like, I didn't expect the way it was, and the ownership, you know, the gift of like, this is this thing that we made and we are giving it now. And, you know, that first time on stage, like the exposure, you know, and the relationship, like, you know, I'm sure all of you guys have had some version of the experience of just being on stage at a film festival, talking with an audience who has like had an emotional response to the thing that you created. And there is a very tangible, like, energetic interaction that is happening in that moment.
Now,
and
that
was my first experience of that, you know, was extreme. You know, it was extreme in many ways.
Now that set off a series of things, right, Ellar? Because that experience that you're talking about, I would assume Richard would agree that we're in the same school of thought of like, that's the most important thing, is seeing an audience connect with it right before your eyes, right? Because people are going to write articles about it, or they're going to do this or pieces on it. But that immediate response of at a film festival, at Sundance, where you know people love cinema, and they're probably are most the harshest critics, because they know what a good film is, right? At least collectively to a certain degree, despite the fact that it's subjective. But that's the most special feeling, a kind of a approval of your peers, if you will, actors, directors, the people who are making films. But let's face it, this film set off a series of events where now Ellar is quite literally the poster child, and going on Kimmel and going on Letterman and going on talk shows and now getting Oscar buzz, now getting like, so what this set off now even a bigger scope. If that was already overwhelming, now what did it do for you as an artist, as a human being going off to do this press run on this film that people are really connecting with, you know?
Right. Well, I mean, in my life since then, what it's done for me is it's, you know, that I have a legacy. I have a reputation. Yeah. I have a space that I exist in within the industry, especially in Austin, that like just opened a lot of doors for me, you know, and allowed me to have a career and a community, you know, and just something. Just my foot in the door of like, oh, we know who this guy is. He grew up on film sets. Like I know how it works, you know, but that, those, I mean, there was about a year and a half of press, of you know, going around to all the festivals and Q&As and then the whole awards trail and all of that.
Did Rick or Ethan or Patricia, did they help you? They've been through that a million times. Did they give you any advice? Did they say, hey, dude, this is your first one. The first one's always the one to remember, or the scariest? You're like, look out for this, look out for that. Did you get any of that?
Or was it?
Yeah, a little bit, you know, for sure. I mean, I'm grateful to have had definitely Ethan and Patricia, you know, around, because they were both child actors, and they, you know, definitely understand to some degree, you know, what that was like. I you know, it was different for me because like to be in that position of having this film be widely received and appreciated and then nominated for awards. It's like, these are things that people work their entire lives for, you know, dream about. And like for so many filmmakers and actors and just people in the industry, like these are these kind of like goals of like, wow, you could go to the Oscars someday, go to these parties, go to these big film festivals. And like, it's not that I didn't want it, but like, it wasn't me. Like I was a little kid, you know, I wasn't acting in Boyhood thinking about like, oh, we're going to go to the Oscars someday. I'm going to be in Hollywood, you know, walking red carpets, talking about this. Like, it was just a project I was working on.
Yeah. The trajectory.
You know? And so my introduction to the, you know, the reality in the world of film publicity and film, like, you know, just appreciation, you know, in that much larger industry sense was very different. And like, I'm just going to be honest, like I hated it.
Good. No, please.
It was like, I'm indie through and through, you know, like I love the process. I love the projects. I love the community, the collaboration, like, you know, crazy guerrilla filmmaking, like just a bunch of people figuring out how to make magic happen together.
And you can tell right away who loves it, right? Who loves that aspect? Because Rick doesn't like being in front of the camera, doesn't like talking in interviews. He leaves that to Ethan, or he leaves that to whoever, right? And that's to you, and that's an error, right? It was you, but you can tell right away who loves the work and loves the art, and you can tell right away who loves the attention, right? And then Boyhood through and through, and what we know of your career so far through and through is that you just love the process. You love the art. So I love that you're confirming that with us, because it's a huge aspect, right?
I got to nerd out a little bit.
Okay.
As a student of acting, and obviously you're a professional, you got to work with one of the icons, Burt Reynolds. How was that experience? Did he teach you anything? Did he
The last movie star.
Oh man, that was such a trip. I mean, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was his last.
Yeah, that was his last performance.
We were talking about that.
Technically, he was supposed to be in Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I think like 2 weeks before production, he passed away. Yeah. So you're right. It was the last one.
Yeah.
Was he an intense person?
So I mean, gosh, Burt was in a special moment in his life when I met him. Ooh. You know, I mean, he was on the way out for sure. Like he was having a hard time, you know, just moving around, you know, doing dialogue. Like it was clear that he was, you know, not long for the world, but like,
yeah.
And so there was a lot of like accommodation that had to happen around that. Like pretty much everything else that was happening on that set was like just being rearranged and orchestrated around Bert, you know, being able to do his work, creating space and the time, and like, oh, like now's like, okay, Bert's feeling up to it now. We got to do it right now. You know, like, that other thing later. Like Bert's here now.
Did you guys shoot that? Where did you shoot that?
Like he was in this very like introspective place.
Okay.
You know, like I mean, it's the only time I've ever met him, so I don't know what he was like at any other time in his life, but the version of him that we met on that set was very different than the image of Burt Reynolds, you know, swaggering mustache, badass, like sex symbol.
It was more introspective, more, you were able to have these very intimate conversations.
He was very introspective. He was talking about a lot of like regret, you know, and just how his body was broken from, you know, from doing his own stunts and from car wrecks and, you know, talking about, you know, broken relationships and, you know, being a womanizer and how he regrets, you know, the way that he treated women when he was young, and, you know, told us about breaking his back on, you know, on Deliverance, because that when he goes over the waterfall, like they had a dummy, and he was like, that's what he was saying, he was like, they had a dummy, and he was like, you wanted to be the badass. Was all cocky, like, no, I'll do it, that'll look stupid, I'm a badass, that's what they do. Like, broke his back on the first take, you know. So it was really interesting. There was a really interesting moment for me to meet him, you know. I think in my life, like having just had the experience with Boyhood and having had this kind of window into being a young film star, you know, and seeing all these, you know, younger versions of the Burt Reynolds, Johnny Depp type of like archetype of like,
and you got to see that. What's interesting is just based off what you're saying, like getting that version of Burt. You got that version of Burt in an indie film. Even his choices were like, I want to do something a little more special. I don't know if he knew this was a swan song or not, but you got to see him work in this capacity of like, what if I skip the steps and go into it in this mentality of like indie and stories that are compelling to me and stories that I know are going to make an impact in the long run, or make an impact in my own life. Was that something that came across your mind? Like, man, that's interesting. Like we're seeing Burt in an indie set telling us these stories, you know?
Definitely. And telling a story that, you know, relates very much to his own experience. Obviously he was not, you know, nearly as like washed up as the character in that film, but still, you know, the woes of being, of like having gone through this experience of being a sex symbol, being an international star, larger than life figure, with just a whole kind of, you know, there's a whole subculture almost of just the swagger of Burt Reynolds. And then just like showing, you know, the kind of some of the anguish of the, you know, of the actual person and the isolation of, you know, of that, I think is really powerful, you know. And I don't know if he knew it was his last film, or, you know, or what his conception of, you know, or what his choice to, you know, to do that film was, you know. But I think it, like Adam was a huge, like, you know, Burt Reynolds fan, like is very much a love letter to him and his legacy, and also an acknowledgement like of his humanity. You know, and I think that story and the offer to him is in some ways like a gift to him, to acknowledge that he's also a human being underneath the whole Burt Reynolds thing. You know, and it seemed like that's what it was about for him, you know. And there were moments on that set where it was just like, all right, now we just, like, this is our chance to like be here with this man and like okay, like, the clock is ticking, money's burning, but Bert's telling us a story right now, and we're all going to stop and listen.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow. That sounds like the best experience you could have gotten out of that situation. Now, you on the other end of the spectrum, you do something like The Circle, right? Ooh. For major studio, kind of a bigger picture, and then the likes of Tom Hanks and Emma. Like, what was your experience on that other end of the spectrum, where you're still working with people who are, have made their mark and by the way, holding your own entirely. Like, I don't know if they brought up any of your past films or Boyhood or anything like that, but your role in that was very electric. It was very and it was very important for the arc of the film in general. So what was your experience on a set like that? More of a major, a bigger picture, anyways, in terms of scale and budget.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Not everyone agrees with you about my performance in that film, so I appreciate it.
No, man, no.
Yeah.
But that was such a different experience. Like, I'm trying to remember the timeline of things. That might have been my first like big post Boyhood job.
Okay.
Because I really to jump back a little bit, like, when I got the part in Boyhood, I was like, I had been auditioning for a couple of years pretty consistently. Like, I had gotten a position with an agency in Austin, and I was kind of doing the grind, the version of the grind in Austin, and did commercials, a couple of indie projects. And like, at the time that Boyhood came around, I was kind of getting tired of it. Like, it wasn't,
and it's always
I was mostly just getting commercials, and it was just all this time and effort to go do the auditions, and it was just like I wasn't getting anything out of it, so I was kind of ready to stop. And like, I almost had to be, I think my mom kind of pushed me a little bit to even do the audition for Boyhood, and then when I got that part, it was like, okay, I've got this, I have this outlet to do this thing that I enjoy doing, but I'm not, so I didn't really audition. I didn't really pursue anything else.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Ellar, but it sounds like too, like, once you got that part, it sounds like you knew you were going to be doing it every year anyways, so it gave you an outlet to be able to know, like, I don't have to go through the audition process for this anymore. I could just do this every year and be cool with it and not worry so much. Explore other films if I want to, or explore other, there's a guarantee for the next 12 years that I'm going to be doing this thing, right? Which
totally, that's how it felt, And so I hadn't really I had that project, but I hadn't been thinking of myself as an actor really for most of my teenage years when we were shooting the film. Like, it was just like, I'm an actor in the sense that I am acting in this film, but the rest of my life, I was doing other stuff, and other kinds of art, and just being a kid. But, all that to say, then post Boyhood, getting the part in The Circle, and I was a big James Ponsoldt fan. Really all of his films. And
The Spectacular Now is always one I always revisit here and there. And the end, the end of the watch, the end of the tour. I'm sorry, the end of the tour is phenomenal.
And what's the one with Aaron Paul and Mary Elizabeth is Smashed, I think.
Smashed. Yeah.
It's both of those films are just gorgeous.
And I'm just a big
I grew up around a lot of alcoholism.
Yeah.
And
I think it was called Wasted.
No, it's called Smashed. It's called Smashed.
End of the tour.
End of the tour
too. I mean, I think that came out not long before we were shooting The Circle, and I also had just read Infinite Jest.
Oh my gosh, David Foster Wallace.
So that. Yeah. I just remember crying, watching Into the Tour and just crying so much. That movie's gorgeous.
So now you got to work with him. This was a guy who.
Yeah, so I was really excited, and it. I mean, it's crazy how different it was than the experiences I had had before, and I got to, I got to really see a window into the I mean, that's not that's still semi indie. That movie inhabits a weird space where it's it's hard to know exactly how to define it.
I guess the names in the film made it what it was in terms of
scale,
major scale, but the actual production itself was more of an indie feel. You mean, or
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just yeah. I mean, in terms of the scale, and then like the choice for Ponsolt to be the director and bring something very different.
Yeah.
Like that film, it could have just it has all the makings to just be like just kind of a blockbuster, like sci-fi set piece action thing, and I think, I mean, of course the subject matter has a lot of depth to it, but then also like the choice to have Ponsolt helm it was a specific choice, that I'm not sure everyone was really prepared for what that meant, and so like the impression that I saw on that set was like almost a collision of worlds.
Wow.
And like
makes
Ponsolt being this like very delicate, very emotionally like internally focused storyteller, that like his whole thing is just the like nasty, painful intricacies of like human interaction. And so much of his craft is about how to get that out of actors. Similar to Richard, like he works very differently, but it's a similar focus and just like the tiniest little things and the tiniest just differences in expression and like just the arguments in his films are like incredible.
Now, in that film, you have how did that play off in being opposite, Emma Watson? I mean, she was your most consistent scene partner as opposed to Tom Hanks or John Boyega or anybody else. But how did that play off to have a good yin and yang between you and Emma?
Yeah, well, I mean, she's the only one I actually worked with. I didn't meet really anyone else until afterward.
To the premiere.
I was never on set with Tom or John or Patton Oswalt or any of those guys. I did get to meet Bill Paxton though, which I was like,
oh cool,
so excited about. I didn't know it would be my last chance at the time, but I loved I loved him as an actor growing up. So I was really, and he was wonderful. He was so like just with his glasses on the tip of his nose, like so just like, doing his work. Like he really loved his craft. But no, with Emma, I mean, it was great. I think honestly, there was a point where like James had to like come to Emma and I and be like, okay, I wrote the script. Like you guys need to just read the script. Like, because we kind of took the freedom and collaborative energy maybe a little too far, I guess.
Gotcha.
But there was a lot, I mean, there's really mainly the one scene like inside of the Circle office is the big one. Like we workshopped that a lot, and I was thinking a lot about specifically some of the scenes in Spectacular Now and the way that like the body language is used in those like the arguments. Like I remember one scene specifically when Miles's character is arguing with his mom, and there's just like I don't know, just the range of emotion in such a short period of time is like bewildering, and so I was thinking about that a lot in that moment in the Circle office when we're being surrounded and I'm like kind of breaking down. And just like part of I think how James achieves that is like that there are wildly different versions of every scene that are all shot right on top of each other. And I think that's my theory. Like I haven't exactly talked to him about it, but like having the experience on set and watching his films, I'm like, oh, maybe that's what's going on here, because it feels very confusing, and I think it's difficult to comprehend like as it's happening, like why, like, okay, we did the take this way, and then that's good, but then now we're doing it in this completely different way, and then going back to something else, and they're all good, and it's like, so like what, it's like it's all over the place, and
And that's just him trying to find like what's the right emotion for the scene, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Well, and then mixing them all together. Like I think that
creating the chaos
at
through
least
the process.
in his earlier films, like experiencing that dynamic on set, I was like, oh, maybe that's how he does that.
Sure.
That it's like that there are 4 takes of this scene that are very different tones,
right?
And then he mixes all of the coverage of that together to create this experience where like
it's a mosaic,
you see someone 1 second and then you cut to the other character and you cut back and they have a totally different facial expression.
Right.
Which like acting it that way feels really like kind of insane and like melodramatic.
Right.
But then seeing it, it's like, no, that's actually kind of more what it's like having an argument with your mom or your ex-girlfriend. Like, you're going through all kinds of different emotions in a very rapid, very short period of time.
Yeah.
And so like it was very chaotic, and there was a lot of just like, I don't know, just trying to figure it out as we were going. That I don't know. Yeah. I really appreciated it. But it was, such a different dynamic, in like, because like Richard has his own world, that he created for himself.
Yeah.
And Boyhood happened in Richard's world. And he like a very collaborative, very generous, very inviting artist. And he is also like the mastermind of everything.
No, it's interesting that you...
The maestro, the puppeteer, it's all his plan.
It's interesting that you point out the difference there because, the past couple films that we've done, like I told you, Michael's my cinematographer and Austin, my producer, and then in a lot of the instances in these past few films, Eric, actor. I will screen films for my crew, and say this is exactly this tonal shift in this particular moment, or the score coming in at this particular thing. And we explored a lot before midnight for this next film that we're getting ready to do, and the hotel scene and the argument in the hotel scene with Ethan and Julie and their characters. And knowing that it's one location and knowing that the switching of just their body language, the switching of their position in the room, him being at a higher point, she being at a higher point in certain instances, is what really makes the scene dynamic. And we go back and forth with references like that, things like In the Mood for Love that are very intentional in that regard. Things like, so like, I think it's super crucial for you to point out the difference and how these processes, if you will, of each director really do matter. They really do matter. And they could be coming from different worlds and they could be, isolated even in their own world. But this intention is everything to us. Like,
because there's so many different ways to explore the same like human emotion or the same human experience of like an argument or finding love or finding distaste for somebody. Losing a friend, all these concepts. I mean,
that's fascinating, Ellar. I'm glad that you can share that experience with us because, like you say, not only are you paying attention as a storyteller, but it informs your acting for one in this regard. And even when you're in art department or you're in other capacities, it has to be informed. It has to be intentional. And if it isn't, it's not gonna deliver. It's not gonna communicate the emotion that you want to communicate in that regard. Wow, that's fascinating insight. Now, Ellar, before we've taken up too much of your time, man. So I want to make sure to respect that. And before we kind of one of the last things I want to talk about is kind of your diving into the indie sets. Now that you've been exposed to all of these worlds, or a good chunk of these worlds within the film industry and quote unquote Hollywood. Coming from fellow indie guys, we see the changes. We see the changes that are happening in the industry. Not most of the changes we're not fans of per se, right? Where the direction of this is heading and where indies are getting left to a certain degree because as a result of it. But I also am of the school of thought that that's up to us, right? Who we share these stories with and how we push for them to be distributed and how we push for them to be exhibited is a huge part on us. So your choices post the circle, if you will. Obviously, we talked about the Weird Kids a little bit, the animated feature, but stuff like, I think between mutual friends, there was a huge talk of like The Man Who Killed Hitler and Bigfoot. And that's because, a couple of the guys here in El Paso were involved with that production and stuff like that. And there was a premiere here in town and whatnot. what are your choices moving forward in that regard? In the regard of like, I'm going to be much more selective with my roles and these stories that I want to tell, and as far out as people think they might be, or as intimate as they think they might be, they're still indie because nobody are telling these stories. So what's your choice in that regard?
I mean, I honestly, that choice, the core of that choice for me is like self-care, you know. It's like my mental health. Like I just like working on indie films, you know. And yeah, I mean, so after The Circle, and you know, I've had a handful of roles, but like the acting thing didn't really take off for me. You know, like it's weird to say that because I was at the Oscars. I was in a film to the Oscars and had this massive success and this experience of fame. But like, you know, that was 10 years ago. And I was auditioning consistently for 5 of those years.
Sure.
And not a lot happened. Not a lot came from it, you know? And so there came a point where I was just kind of like, okay, like, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to make money? And I was introduced to art department, you know, like really the Rodney Becker, who was the production designer on Boyhood the entire time, hired me, you know, for his crew.
Wow.
And so I started working mostly on commercials with them. And like, that was kind of my bread and butter for many years, really until COVID, you know, like I was kind of pretty consistently just like set dressing on commercials. Like there's a lot of that in Austin, you know, and it was good work, and like started to discover the, you know, the real guerrilla, like ultra low budget filmmaking and what that is, you know, and like connecting with a director with a crazy idea and not a lot of money, and like staying up for weeks at a time and just like doing this insane thing and having this bonding experience with people, and, you know, applying the skills that like most of it I've just learned through like osmosis, you know, like there's so much that I, of course, like learned from Rodney, and Aaron Statler is his first, and like, you know, the you know, the specific tricks of, you know, set dressing and production design, like there's tons that I learned there, but like there's so much of just like the dynamics of a set and the ways that you have to think in certain circumstances on set that like I just grew up with, you know. And so like I discovered that there's just some benefit that I can bring to really small productions with folks who haven't made a lot of movies or haven't worked on, you know, bigger projects with bigger crews. And like, and there's a weird part of it too, that like, it's weird for me to talk about because it's like, just who I am, like brings something like contextually to a project that like, just because of the film and my kind of legacy in the industry, it's like my presence on a set brings something, you know, and like realizing that and coming to terms with it, like it's weird.
No,
it's
but
weird
it's massive. It's
that
massive.
because it's not like, it doesn't come from a place of like arrogance or like I'm so awesome. Like, just being there is like, but like
it's having to acknowledge that, you know, internal elephant in the room, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The elephant in the room for sure.
No, but it's good. It's good. Do you know how much confidence you give indie filmmakers just by they may not call that out, but I could, I will call that out. I mean, having conversations with you about just even the projects we're working on or certain scripts, certain things, it's like, oh, you know what? Somebody who's done this before on a legitimate scale, working with heroes of ours who you know, probably bumps into these guys from time to time still, and they're still talking about projects and they're still talking about things like it validates the filmmaker that you're working with. It validates the set that, and not only are you validating them by your being there, because it is true, but you're also contributing to their stories, something that's very special to them at that point. I mean, it's massive.
Yeah, the validation of I've been there.
Yeah.
I've been to the Oscars. I've been to those parties. I've been in that space of like the, you know, top tier of capitalist filmmaking.
Yeah.
And I'm choosing this. Like I'm choosing to go into rural Alabama and stay up all night with a bunch of fucking weirdos and make this insane movie because this is awesome. And these are real people doing something that's like important that they need to do.
Yeah.
You know, like filmmaking is a way out for a lot of people. Like it's more than just a career or an art form or a product that you're making. It's like being a part of the world and a part of the mechanism and lending yourself and your time to like collectively create something is like, it's, you know, it's a ritual practice and it's a therapeutic practice that people that we use, you know, to understand our lives and also escape our lives, you know, and approaching it like that reality and that like motivation for filmmaking as like both the process and the product as a gift, like to oneself and also to like the immediate community is so much more tangible the smaller you go. You know, it's like the harder that someone is working to get a film made, the more it needs to be made. You know, like you wouldn't be trying this hard if you didn't need to do this.
Absolutely.
This guy gets
it.
Like,
he gets it. He gets it.
Yeah, that's what I like in it.
You may have already said it, Ellar, but the way we kind of like to wrap up the podcast is there any advice you have for storytellers? Would that be something that you're advising? Is there something more that you want to add to that particular piece of like, go this route because this is what's real. Yeah. This is what's
absolutely. I mean, for me, like having had the experience, this kind of full circle of like starting, you know, very dirty, low budget guerrilla, just anarchist kind of art world, and then going to Hollywood and then coming back around. It's like, you know, I was so inspired by the Weird Kids and being at the premiere of the Weird Kids and just seeing, because that film is so local. You know, like I think it absolutely has appeal to a much wider audience. As we're seeing, like people all over the country are enjoying it, but like
all over the world. It just came back from Europe, from Paris, I think, a festival,
totally.
Animation festival.
It's incredible, but there is something like it is this labor of love that is like by a local, about the place, for people from the place. And like, and that I guess that's the advice, is just that like, not only is that enough, but like, that's also something unique, you know, and something that to me at this point in my life and career is more important and more exciting. Like creating something that resonates on a personal level with a specific group of people and the creator and the creator's family, you know, like that, just like community-based art that is made by a community for the same community. And I just think with the industry and the commodification of film, it's so easy to get caught up in the grandeur and the like, there's always another step. There's always another like, you know, we get on Netflix, we go to get awards or whatever. And like, all of this is great. Of course, exposure is how you get money to make bigger movies. But like, I just think it's not quite all it's cracked up to be.
Sure.
And there's so much like beauty and resonance to be found in like making art and making films that are not for that. They're not for the whole world. They're not for the machine. They're for us.
Yeah.
You know?
Kind of like
and if they catch on, that's great.
Yeah.
But like sometimes maybe it's better if they don't. You know, like I think about Boyhood, like I don't have any like regret or resentment exactly about what happened with Boyhood. And, you know, it allowed me to like, I own a home in my 20s. So like, that's pretty cool. And I have this legacy that kind of gets me in the door in a lot of film situations. But I also just think about like how different it would be if it hadn't been like that.
Yeah.
You know, if Boyhood was more like Slacker, or like a cult thing that like everyone in Austin knows about, and like film nerds know about, like that's a very different space for a film to inhabit. And I think once a film crosses a certain threshold into like wider consumption, you can't ever really go back. You can't ever really experience it in the same way that you would if it were more contained.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's fair. But I also think like something like Boyhood, at least when I screen it for people who haven't seen it, it still lives in that realm for me and for other people. Like, this film, the headline of it was made in 12 years. Cool. Great. Legacy type stuff. But let's look at this trajectory of this kid and look at the trajectory of these parents and the dynamics that we had to go through to get to this very beautiful sunset point at the end of the film, and just how much of an arc there is there. Like the people I screen it for are always like, how did I not know about this? I'm like, that's kind of the point. I'm glad it wasn't this oversaturated thing for you. I'm glad that you get to experience it blindly and then walk out of there feeling much more fulfilled to a certain degree about experiencing this film.
And I think it comes down to being a part of projects that have heart, right? Because you can see projects that were made and go to theaters and you feel like, was there any soul behind that? Or was it just something that was, supposed to be really marketable? And then like we saw with Weird Kids here in El Paso when we had the screening, the entire community was just so appreciative of what was now made and put into the world, and your part in all that. It's something that can't be taken away, and I think it's nice to see that you have found the value in that, and even like you say, the whole full circle trajectory where that's not something that should go away. You shouldn't just get jaded and then move on and say, okay, well, you do local first and then you move on. No, there's a place for it, and there's also people that really appreciate something that we can bring into the world.
That's true.
Totally.
Ellar, man, I can't thank you enough, man. This has been massively insightful. And again, this is just it's exciting to know that there are people still out there who get it.
Yes.
Get it. And you're a prime example of that, man. On top of being a phenomenal actor, on top of being a phenomenal storyteller, you give a shit at the bottom line, like, pardon my way of putting it, but you give a shit. And I hope that filmmakers could take away from that. Like, as long as you give a shit, but like genuinely give a shit for all the right reasons, your art is going to touch somebody. Your art is really going to connect with somebody. And that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do get it. I do give a shit. I mean, I think that's the advice. It's just like, film is important. And I think to think of film as a device.
Yeah.
Like it's a tool that we can use for a lot of things.
Absolutely. Well, you heard it here on the TowerCast podcast. We had the amazing Ellar Coltrane on the show, just giving us a ton of insight on the amazing projects he's been in and just the advice that he gives that he's going to continue to carry on. And I'm just excited for the next projects that you're going to do, Ellar, because I know that whatever project it is, your heart is in it. You're dedicated. You're all in, man. And that's something special for director, writer, storytellers to notice from somebody. So thank you guys for tuning into the podcast, man. Make sure and just, keep track of what Ellar's doing. And anytime you see his name, just watch it, because it's going to be special. And stay tuned for the next couple episodes. We have some more great guests that we're going to talk to down the line on the TowerCast. And check in over at the Watchtower Film Podcast. We're going to be reviewing a ton of great films this month and leading up into like Halloween and getting into some really cool Halloween picks and the live film cafe stuff. Come join us once a month. at the Film Cafe. It's a ton of fun, big blast. We have some beers. We talk film.
We want to hear from everybody.
Yeah, we want to hear from everybody. So, Ellar, again, I can't thank you enough, man.
Thank you so much.
And make sure and check this out, people. Help us share this episode. Help us by liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing. Let's get the word out, man. We just love to talk cinema with other people like Ellar who love cinema as well. So thank you so much for tuning in to the TowerCast Podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.